They called them l'enfant de l'honte, the children of shame. Between 1908 and 1960, somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 mixed-race children vanished from the Belgian Congo, torn from their African mothers' arms by colonial authorities who documented every transaction with bureaucratic precision. The Belgian government kept these records sealed for decades, hidden in basement archives in Brussels, marked classified until 2017. What happened to those children was not a secret kept by whispers or rumors. It was a secret kept by filing cabinets, stamped documents, and official policies written in careful French cursive. The mothers who search for their stolen children were told the same thing again and again. It is for their own good. But whose good exactly? Before we continue with the story of Maritis Kawena and the children who disappeared into the Catholic missions of Katanga province, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what you're about to hear is a documented horror that most history books conveniently forget to mention. And please leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. This story needs to be heard everywhere. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't hidden in the shadows of history. It was written down, approved by committees, and executed with the same efficiency Belgium used to extract rubber and copper from Congolese soil. This wasn't the work of a few rogue individuals. It was a systemic, institutionalized program of child removal designed to maintain a fragile colonial order at the expense of human dignity and the most fundamental of human bonds. The meticulousness of the record-keeping, the cold, detached language of the decrees, and the unwavering conviction of those who implemented them paint a picture of a horror far more insidious than any act of overt violence. It was a violence of erasure, a cruelty cloaked in the guise of charity and progress. Elizabethville, now known as Lubumbashi, sprawled across the copper-rich Katanga province like a European fantasy dropped into the African savanna. By 1923, the city had become the colonial jewel of the Belgian Congo, its wide boulevards lined with jacaranda trees imported from South America, their purple blossoms a stark contrast to the red dust that coated everything. The administrative buildings, constructed with a particular European arrogance that assumed permanence, boasted grand facades and cool tiled interiors. This was a city built on the sweat and blood of the Congolese, designed to serve the interests of the Belgian crown and the Union Minier Duo Katanga, the powerful mining conglomerate that extracted vast quantities of copper, cobalt, and uranium from the earth. The city was divided with surgical precision, a physical manifestation of the racial hierarchy that governed every aspect of life. The European Quarter, with its manicured gardens, tennis courts, and social clubs, occupied the elevated ground where the breeze was coolest and the air was less thick with the dust from the mines. Here, Belgian families lived lives of relative luxury, attended by a retinue of African servants. Below them, sprawling across the lowlands, where the air hung thick and still during the dry season, was the Cité Inden, the native quarter. A labyrinth of unpaved streets, crowded mud brick houses, and rudimentary markets. It was a world apart, separated by invisible but impenetrable barriers of race and power. The colonial administration employed a peculiar and rigid hierarchy. At the apex sat the Belgian administrators, often young men sent from Brussels on 3-year contracts that promised adventure, wealth, and a chance to make their mark in the civilizing mission. Below them worked the agents, territorial, lower-level officials who managed the day-to-day brutality of colonial rule, enforcing labor quotas, collecting taxes, and maintaining order with an iron fist. And scattered throughout this system were the Evalu men who had received mission education, spoke French, wore European clothes, and occupied that dangerous middle ground between two worlds that would never fully accept them. They were educated enough to be useful, but never quite European enough to be equal. Marie-Thérèse Kawena worked as a domestic servant in the home of Albert de Samps, a mining engineer from Liazga, who had arrived in Elizabethville in 1920 with a wife, 2 children, and ambitions that exceeded his modest position with Union Minier Duo Katanga. She was 19 years old, daughter of a Luba chief who had sent her to the Catholic mission school. There she had learned to read French, embroider linens, and understand that education was supposed to be her path to a better life, a bridge to opportunity. Instead, it had led her to Deason's household, where she scrubbed floors, prepared meals, and tried to remain invisible, a ghost in the opulent European home. The thing about colonial households was that invisibility was impossible for young African women. They existed in a strange quantum state, simultaneously beneath notice and under constant scrutiny. Their bodies considered both inferior and available, their humanity acknowledged just enough to make them useful, but never enough to grant them protection. Maritz moved through the Desums home with a quiet dignity. Her eyes downcast, her movements precise. She understood the unspoken rules. Never meet a European's gaze directly. Speak only when spoken to, anticipate every need. Yet beneath her composed exterior, a quiet resentment simmered. She had been taught to aspire, to believe in the promise of education, only to find herself trapped in a different kind of servitude. Albert Desong was a man of average height and unremarkable features, but with an air of self-importance that seemed to inflate with every year he spent in the Congo. He saw his African staff not as individuals but as extensions of his household, tools to ensure his comfort. His interactions with Maritere were brief, transactional, and often accompanied by a dismissive wave of his hand. His wife Marguerite was a woman of sharp angles and sharper opinions, meticulously maintaining the illusion of European civility in the heart of Africa. She presided over her household with an air of perpetual dissatisfaction, constantly finding fault, constantly reminding her servants of their perceived shortcomings. She was particularly vigilant about maintaining the racial boundaries, a silent guardian of the colonial order within her own home. By March of 1924, Maritz was pregnant. The subtle changes in her body, the morning sickness she tried desperately to conceal, did not escape Marguerite's notice. Marguerite Desamp, a woman who prided herself on her observational skills, noticed first the way women always notice these things, and her reaction was not shock, but cold, calculated fury. Not fury at her husband, of course. That would have required acknowledging what everyone in the European quarter already knew, but never discussed. That Belgian men routinely impregnated their African servants, and that these pregnancies represented not a moral failing, but a logistical problem. To acknowledge Albert's culpability would be to disrupt the carefully constructed facade of European moral superiority. It was easier and far more convenient to blame the African woman, to frame her as the temptress, the instigator, the source of the problem. The problem, as the colonial administration saw it, was the children. Mixed-race children, Mate, as they were officially classified, disrupted the colonial order. They were living evidence of intimacy across the color line. Proof that the racial hierarchies Belgium had constructed were permeable, vulnerable, ultimately artificial. Their very existence challenged the notion of a clear, unreachable divide between colonizer and colonized. More practically, they complicated inheritance laws, raised uncomfortable questions about paternity, and threatened to create a class of people who belonged fully to neither world, a potential source of instability and dissent. The Belgians, obsessed with order and control, could not tolerate such ambiguity. The Belgian solution was characteristically bureaucratic: removal, relocation, and re-education. The children would be taken from their African mothers and placed in Catholic missions specifically established for Mate children, where they would be raised as Europeans, or at least as European as their mixed blood would allow. The mothers would be compensated with a small payment and the assurance that their children were receiving opportunities they could never provide. The fathers would be absolved of responsibility, their reputations protected. The colonial order would remain intact, its fragile racial purity preserved. Marita gave birth to a daughter on November 3, 1924, in the native hospital where Congolese women delivered their babies on metal tables under the supervision of a single overworked Flemish nurse. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and fear, the cries of newborns echoing in the sterile corridors. She named her daughter Celeste after the mission school teacher who had been kind to her, a woman who had once offered a glimmer of hope. For 3 months she kept the baby hidden in the servants' quarters behind the dish house, a small cramped room with a single window overlooking the dusty backyard. She nursed her in the dark hours before dawn, her heart a constant drum of anxiety, singing lubber lullabies in whispers, trying to imprint every detail of her daughter's tiny face onto her memory. But you cannot hide a baby forever, especially not in a colonial city where every African's movements were monitored, documented, and controlled. The network of informants, the casual surveillance by European employers, the constant pressure to conform to colonial expectations all conspired against Maritz. The whispers began, the subtle glances, the questions from other servants. It was only a matter of time before the problem of Celeste would be officially addressed. The men came on a Tuesday morning in February 1925 when the jacaranda trees were blooming, their purple petals littering the red earth, and the air smelled like copper dust from the distant mines. The sun was already high, beating down with an oppressive intensity that promised a long, hot day. There were three of them. Father Gustave Lair from the Mission de San Josef, a territorial agent named Pieta Vandenberg, and a Congolese policeman whose name Maritz never learned, but whose face she would remember for the rest of her life. Young, perhaps 25, his expression carefully neutral as he stood behind the two white men, a silent, imposing shadow. They had papers. Father Lair, a gaunt man with thin lips and eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual judgment, held them carefully, as if the documents themselves were sacred objects imbued with divine authority. He explained in slow, deliberate French, his voice devoid of warmth, that Celeste had been classified as a Métis child under Colonial Decree 1523 of 1920. This decree, he recited, granted the state authority to remove mixed-race children from their mother's custody if the father was European and the mother was deemed incapable of providing appropriate upbringing. The words were a torrent of bureaucratic euphemisms, a legalistic shield for an act of profound cruelty. The decree had been written in Brussels by men who had never set foot in Africa, approved by a colonial minister who believed he was solving a problem, and implemented by priests who believed they were saving souls, delivering children from the perceived moral and social degradation of their African mothers. Marie TZ understood perhaps half of what Father Lair said. Permission school French was adequate for household instructions and market transactions, but not for legal terminology and the convoluted justifications of colonial policy. What she understood completely, however, was the gesture Vandenberg made toward the baby in her arms. Peter Vandenberg, a man whose uniform was always impeccably pressed, whose movements were always precise, extended a hand, a silent command. His eyes, cold and blue, held no empathy, only the detached efficiency of a man performing a duty. She ran. Not far. There was nowhere to run in a colonial city where every street led back to European authority. Every path was monitored. Every corner held the potential for surveillance. But she ran far enough to make them chase her through the servants' quarters, past the outdoor kitchen where the cook, a woman named Adisa, was preparing breakfast, her eyes wide with silent horror. Maritz burst into the narrow alley behind the property where laundry hung on lines, flapping like distressed flags in the hot breeze, and chickens scattered at her approach, squawking in protest. She made it perhaps 50 millas, her bare feet pounding the dusty ground. Celeste clutched tightly to her chest before the Congolese policeman caught her. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he gripped her arms, his voice low and urgent in Swahili, a language the white men did not understand. Don't make this worse. They will take her anyway. Don't make them hurt you too. His eyes, though neutral, held a flicker of something Marie TZ recognized. Resignation, a shared understanding of powerlessness. The sound Marie TZ made when they pulled Celeste from her arms was not quite a scream. It was something deeper, more primal. A sound that came from a place beyond language, a tearing of the soul. The cook, Adisa, would later tell other servants that she had never heard anything like it, that it sounded like something breaking that could never be repaired, a sound that would haunt her dreams for years. Father Lair held the baby awkwardly, his arms stiff, unused to infants, while Vandenberg produced another document, a receipt essentially, acknowledging that one Mate female child, approximately 3 months old, had been transferred from the custody of Marie TZ Coena to the Mission de San Josef for proper Christian upbringing. He offered her a pen to sign. When she refused, her hands trembling too violently to hold it, he signed it himself, marking her signature line with an X, as if her illiteracy was assumed, her consent irrelevant, her very existence a mere formality in their bureaucratic process. They paid her 200 francs. Vandenberg counted the bills carefully, his fingers precise, placed them in her hand, and closed her fingers around them with a gesture that might have been meant as kindness, or perhaps just a final dismissive act. The money represented approximately 2 months of her wages as a domestic servant. The colonial administration had calculated the value of a mother's child with the same cold precision they used to calculate the value of extracted copper ore. It was a transaction, a purchase, a final insult. The entire transaction took less than 15 minutes. By the time Marguerite Desson emerged from the main house to see what the commotion was about, drawn by the unusual noise, the men were already walking back toward their vehicle. A black Ford truck with administration territorial painted on the side, its engine idling impatiently. Marita was on her knees in the red dust, the 200 francs scattered around her like fallen jacaranda petals, making that terrible sound that was not quite crying and not quite screaming, but something worse than either, a sound of utter desolation. What Marguerite Desson did next would be remembered by the household staff for years afterward, a chilling testament to the casual cruelty of the colonial system. She walked past Marie-Thérèse without a word, her face a mask of indifference, went back into the house and rang the bell for morning tea, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if the removal of an African woman's child was so ordinary, so expected, so utterly unremarkable that it did not even merit acknowledgement. And in a sense, she was right. This was not unusual. This was policy. This was the quiet bureaucratic horror of the Belgian Congo. The mission to San Joseph sat 15 km outside Elizabethville, a cluster of whitewashed buildings baking under the relentless Katangan sun. It was accessible only by a rooted dirt road that became an impassable quagmire during the rainy season, effectively isolating it from the city. The mission had been established in 1922 specifically to house Maté children funded by a combination of colonial government subsidies and donations from Belgian Catholic organizations that believed they were supporting civilizing work in darkest Africa. By 1925, it housed 43 children ranging in age from infants to 12-year-olds, all of them light-skinned enough to mark them as mixed race. All of them separated from their mothers under the authority of Colonial Decree 1523. The children were given new names. Celeste Kina became Celeste Deason. The fathers' surnames were used whether the fathers acknowledged paternity or not. A perverse form of recognition. Her birth records were amended to list her place of birth as the mission itself, as if she had materialized there spontaneously without a mother, without a history, without a past that connected her to the Congolese world her mother inhabited. It was a systematic erasure, a bureaucratic act of cultural genocide. Father L. Clerc ran the mission with the rigid discipline of a man who believed that African blood was a contamination that could be diluted through education, prayer, and strict adherence to European customs. He saw himself as a shepherd, guiding lost lambs to salvation, purifying them of their primitive heritage. The children spoke only French. Congolese languages were forbidden, punished with hours of kneeling on dried corn kernels in the chapel, a painful reminder of their savage tongues. They ate with forks and knives, wore shoes, even in the brutal heat, learned Belgian history and Catholic catechism, and were taught that their mothers had given them up willingly out of love because they wanted their children to have better lives, to escape the poverty and ignorance of their native villages. It was a narrative carefully constructed to sever the most fundamental of human bonds. Some of the older children remembered their mothers. They whispered about them at night in the dormitories, sharing fragmented memories of lullabies and smells and the feeling of being held. These memories, precious and fragile, were often accompanied by guilt, for they were taught that to remember their African past was to betray the mission's efforts to civilize them. But the younger ones, the ones taken as infants like Celeste, grew up believing the mission was their only home, the priests and nuns their only family. Belgium, a distant motherland they had never seen, but were taught to revere as the source of all good. Their identities were forged in a vacuum, disconnected from their true origins. Marie TZ tried to visit. The first time she walked the 15 kilometers in the early morning, her feet already aching, arriving at the mission gates as the sun was climbing toward its zenith, casting long, distorted shadows. A Flemish nun named Sister Margarita, a stern woman with a perpetually disapproving expression, met her at the entrance. The mission was surrounded by a high wall topped with broken glass, ostensibly to keep wild animals out, but functionally to keep the children in and unauthorized visitors away. Sister Margareta explained in the patient, condescending tone one uses with children, or the simple-minded that visits from biological mothers were not permitted. The children were adjusting to their new lives. Contact with their past would only confuse them, make the transition more difficult. It was better this way, cleaner, more efficient. Mars came back the next week and the week after that. Each time she was turned away, the same polite but firm refusal, the same cold logic. On her fourth visit, Father Léon himself came to the gate. He was less patient than Sister Margarita, his French clipped and cold, his eyes narrowed with irritation. He informed her that if she continued to disturb the mission, he would report her to the territorial administration for harassment. There were laws about this sort of thing. She could be arrested, fined, possibly imprisoned. Did she understand? She understood. She understood the threat, the power imbalance, the futility of her pleas. She stopped coming to the gate, but she did not stop coming to the mission. Instead, she began walking the perimeter of the wall slowly, methodically, looking for gaps, for places where she might see inside, might catch a glimpse of a child who might be her daughter. The mission children played in a courtyard visible from a section of the wall where the ground rose slightly. If you stood in exactly the right spot, balanced precariously on a termite mound, you could see over the broken glass to where the children ran and played under the watchful supervision of the nuns. Mar went there every Sunday afternoon when the children had recreation time. She watched them for hours, her heart a raw wound, trying to identify Celeste among the light-skinned children in identical white dresses. But infant faces change quickly, and she had only had 3 months to memorize her daughter's features. After a while, she could not be certain which child was hers. Maybe the girl with the round face, maybe the one who laughed loudly, maybe none of them. Maybe Celeste had been transferred to another mission. There were several scattered across the colony, all serving the same purpose, all part of the same vast dehumanizing system. Other mothers came too. Maritz was not alone in her vigil. There was Josephine, whose son, a bright-eyed boy named Patrice, had been taken when he was 2 years old, his laughter still echoing in her memory. There was Amina, a quiet woman from a village near the Lualaba River who had given birth to twins, both removed, both given to the mission, leaving her with an unbearable emptiness. There was Beatrice, who had worked for a Belgian doctor and had been dismissed immediately after her daughter, a spirited girl named Sylvie, was taken, left without employment, without references, without recourse. They stood together on that termite mound, these women who had been deemed unfit to raise their own children, their faces etched with a shared grief, and they watched the mission courtyard like it was a window into a world they were no longer permitted to enter, a world that had stolen their futures. The colonial administration did not see this as cruelty. They saw it as progress. In Brussels, officials wrote reports about the Mate program, praising its efficiency, its humanitarian goals, its success in preventing the formation of a problematic mixed-race underclass. The children were being saved from lives of poverty and confusion. Raised as Christians, educated as Europeans, their mothers were being spared the burden of children they could not properly care for. Everyone benefited. The system worked. It was a perfect self-justifying machine of human separation. But systems built on the premise that some people's children belong to the state have a way of expanding, of finding new categories of children who need saving, new reasons why mothers are unfit, new justifications for separation. By 1930, the mission to St. Joseph housed over 100 children. By 1935, there were 3 more missions established across Katanga province alone, each one dedicated to the same purpose, each one a silent monument to stolen childhoods. The program was expanding, systematizing, becoming more efficient. The colonial government began requiring all Métis children to be registered at birth. Their mothers identified their fathers, documented when possible. Territorial agents were given quotas, not officially of course, but everyone understood that finding and removing Mate children was part of their job performance, a metric by which their dedication to colonial order was measured. And Maritere, who had once believed that education would save her, who had trusted the priests and the promises of the mission school, learned a different lesson entirely. That the same institutions that taught her to read and write could also teach her that her love for her child mattered less than colonial policy, that her motherhood was conditional, revocable, subject to the approval of men who would never see her as fully human. She kept the 200 francs. She never spent them. She kept them in a small cloth bag hidden under the floorboards of whatever room she was living in, moving them with her when she changed employment, when she moved from one household to another, when she eventually left Elizabethville entirely. The bills grew soft with age, the ink fading, but she kept them anyway, as evidence, as proof, as a reminder of the price the Belgian government had placed on her daughter. A constant, tangible ache in her heart. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. In 1936, something shifted. A subtle tremor in the rigid structure of the mission to San Jose. Father Lair, whose stern countenance had become synonymous with the mission's unyielding discipline, was replaced by a younger priest, Father Antoine Dubois. Dubois had arrived from Belgium with different ideas about the Mate program, a quiet unease stirring within him about the moral implications of their work. He had studied theology at Leuven, a university known for its progressive intellectual currents, and had written his dissertation on the moral obligations of colonial powers toward indigenous populations, a topic that had earned him both praise from progressive Catholic intellectuals and suspicion from the colonial administration, which did not particularly want priests who asked uncomfortable questions about the morality of their policies. Dubois was meticulous, but his meticulousness served a different purpose than he began keeping different records. In addition to the official documentation required by the colonial government, names, ages, dates of admission, fathers' identities when known, he started a private ledger, a small leather-bound book he kept hidden in his desk. In this ledger, he recorded the children's stories, their fragmented memories, their unspoken fears. He interviewed the older children, the ones who remembered their mothers, and he wrote down what they told him, often in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously. He noted which children cried at night, which ones asked about their families, which ones had stopped asking because they had learned that questions about their mothers were discouraged, redirected, or punished with extra prayers and additional chores. He saw the psychological toll of this enforced amnesia, the quiet desperation beneath the surface of their carefully constructed European identities. He also began documenting something else, something far more disturbing. The children were disappearing, not all of them, and not obviously, but gradually, systematically, certain children were being transferred away from the mission with minimal documentation and no explanation. The official records would note transferred to Belgium for continued education or placed with approved family or simply relocated. But when Dubois tried to follow up to find out where these children had gone, he encountered bureaucratic walls, a polite but firm refusal to provide details. The colonial administration told him it was not his concern. The children were being given opportunities. He should be grateful that Belgian families were willing to take them in to offer them a better life. But Dubois was not grateful. He was suspicious because the children who disappeared were always the lightest-skinned ones, the ones who could most easily pass as European, the ones whose African heritage was least visible. And the families they were supposedly placed with never visited, never wrote, never sent photographs or updates. The children simply vanished into Belgium, into a country most of them had never seen, to live with families whose names Dubois was not permitted to know. It was as if they had ceased to exist, their past erased, their future a blank slate dictated by colonial policy. He started writing letters to the colonial ministry in Brussels, to Catholic organizations in Belgium, to other priests running similar missions across the Congo. He asked questions carefully phrased but insistent. Where were the children going? Who were these families? What happened to the children after they arrived in Belgium? Were they adopted legally? Were they being treated well? Did they maintain any connection to their Congolese heritage, to their mothers, to their identities? Most of his letters went unanswered. The few responses he received were vague, bureaucratic, designed to provide information without actually revealing anything. One letter from a colonial official in Brussels was more direct, a thinly veiled warning. Father Dubois, your concern for these children is admirable, but you must understand that the Mate program serves a larger purpose. These children are being given opportunities their mothers could never provide. Your role is to prepare them for European life, not to question the wisdom of the policies that govern their futures. I trust you will focus on your duties and leave administrative matters to those qualified to handle them. The letter was dated April 12, 1937, and it was signed by Henri Jaspar, Director of Native Affairs for the Belgian Congo. Dubois kept it in his private ledger along with all the other documentation he was accumulating, a growing archive of evidence that something deeply wrong was happening, even if he could not yet articulate exactly what it was or the full extent of its horror. Meanwhile, Marie TZ had not given up. She had left the Duchamp household in 1926, unable to continue working in the place where her daughter had been taken. The memories too painful, too raw. She found employment with other European families, moving through a series of positions always dismissed after a few months or a year when her employers grew tired of her silence, her sadness, her inability to perform cheerfulness. Her grief was an inconvenient truth in their carefully constructed world. By 1937, she was working for a Belgian accountant named Louis Vermeer, a widower with no children who needed someone to manage his household and did not particularly care about her emotional state as long as his meals were prepared and his clothes were clean. Vermeer was different from the other Belgians Maritaras had worked for. He was older, perhaps 60, his face lined with years spent under the African sun, and he had lived in the Congo for over 20 years. He spoke Swahili fluently, treated his Congolese employees with a brusque respect that was unusual among Europeans, and kept to himself, spending his evenings reading or working on the accounting ledgers he brought home from the mining company where he worked. He was a man of numbers, of facts, of quiet observation. He noticed that Moritz went out every Sunday afternoon, always in the same direction, always returning after dark, her face a little more drawn, a little more tired. He never asked where she went, but one Sunday in June, 1937, a quiet curiosity overriding his usual reserve, he followed her. He watched her walk to the mission wall, her figure small against the vastness of the landscape, climb onto the termite mound, and stand there for hours, a silent sentinel, watching the children play in the courtyard. He saw the other women who joined her, saw how they stood together in silence, a community of shared sorrow, saw how they left when the sun began to set, walking back toward the city in a loose group, their faces carefully blank, their grief a private burden. The next morning, over breakfast, Vimer asked Moritz a single question, his voice low, devoid of judgment. "Which one is yours?" She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his, trying to determine if this was a trap, if answering would lead to punishment or dismissal. 12 years of colonial employment had taught her caution, taught her that European kindness usually came with conditions, with expectations, with prices that were not named up front. Finally, she said in careful French, her voice barely a whisper, "I do not know anymore. They all look the same in those dresses. I think maybe the tall one with the dark hair, but I am not certain." The admission was a fresh wound, the uncertainty, a constant torment. Vimer nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Then he said something that would change everything, a simple offer that held the weight of a lifetime of unspoken pain. "I know someone at the Colonial Archives. If you want, I can find out what happened to your daughter, where she is, if she is still at the mission, or if she was sent somewhere else." It was a lifeline offered unexpectedly in a world that had offered her only despair. Marie-Thérèse, despite her ingrained distrust, knew that this might be her only chance to find out what had happened to Celeste. So she nodded once, a single decisive movement, and said, "Yes, please." It took Vermeer 3 weeks to get the information. His contact at the Colonial Archives was a Flemish clerk named Dice, a nervous, bespectacled man who owed him favors. Veer had helped him navigate some complicated financial issues involving property inheritance, a discreet service that had earned him a quiet loyalty. Dice was willing to bend the rules about accessing confidential files, his fear of Vermeer's displeasure outweighing his fear of colonial authority. He found Celeste's records, meticulously copied them by hand, and passed them to Veer in an envelope marked personal correspondence, a flimsy disguise for a devastating truth. What Vermeer read in those documents made him physically ill. Celeste Deamp, born November 3, 1924, admitted to Mission de San Josef, February 17, 1925, had been transferred to Belgium on August 4, 1932 at age 7. The transfer documents listed her destination as Orphelinat-sur Bruges and noted that she had been placed there under the Maté Repatriation Program, an initiative designed to relocate light-skinned mixed-race children to Belgium, where they could be fully integrated into European society. The language was chillingly clinical, devoid of any human emotion. But there was more. Attached to the transfer documents was a medical assessment dated July 1932 that classified Celeste as suitable for European placement due to minimal negroid features. The assessment included precise measurements, skull circumference, nose width, skin tone compared to a standardized color chart, and concluded that she could pass as European with appropriate training and documentation. It was a scientific justification for racial engineering, a cold, calculated analysis of her physical attributes to determine her suitability for erasure. The documentation also included a new birth certificate issued by the Belgian colonial government that listed Celeste's birthplace as Bruges, Belgium, and her parents as unknown. Her entire Congolese identity had been erased, replaced with a fiction that would allow her to live in Belgium without the stigma of African heritage. She had been, in the chilling language of the documents, whitened. Her past had been meticulously scrubbed away, her origins rewritten, her very existence redefined by the stroke of a pen. Vermeer showed the papers to Marie-Thérèse. She could not read all of the French. The medical terminology was beyond her, a complex web of scientific racism. But she understood enough. Her daughter had been taken to Belgium, given a false identity, and placed in an orphanage where she would be raised believing she was fully European with no knowledge of her mother, her heritage, or her true origins. The truth, when it finally came, was a new kind of agony. "Can I get her back?" Marie-Thérèse asked, her voice steady, a testament to her profound resilience. But her hands shook uncontrollably as she held the papers, the flimsy sheets of paper holding the fate of her child. Vermeer did not answer immediately. He was a practical man, an accountant, someone who understood systems and how they worked, and he knew the brutal logic of the colonial machine. Finally, he said, his voice heavy with regret, "No, not legally. According to these documents, Celeste Dion does not exist anymore. The girl in Bruges is a different person with different papers. And even if you could prove she was your daughter, the colonial government would never allow a Congolese woman to reclaim a child who has been successfully integrated into European society. It would undermine the entire program, expose the lie at its heart. Then what can I do?" Her voice was a desperate plea, a mother's cry against an insurmountable wall. Vermeer thought about this for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dusty street outside. Then he said, his voice quiet but firm, "You can tell people what happened. You can make sure this is not forgotten. You can find the other mothers and document their stories. You can create a record that cannot be erased, a truth that cannot be denied." It was not the answer Mars wanted, not the reunion she craved, but it was the only answer that was true, the only path to a different kind of justice. So she began to do exactly that. She sought out the other women who stood at the mission wall every Sunday, their silent vigil now imbued with a new, urgent purpose. She asked them to tell her their stories, when their children were taken, by whom, under what circumstances. She could not write well enough to record everything herself. So Vermeer helped her, taking dictation in the evenings after dinner, filling notebook after notebook with testimonies from women who had been told their grief did not matter. Their motherhood was conditional. Their children belonged to the state. Each story was a fresh wound, a testament to the pervasive cruelty of the system. By 1938, they had documented over 60 cases. 60 women whose children had been taken under Colonial Decree 1523. 60 children who had been removed, renamed, relocated, erased. And these were just the cases they knew about, just the women in Elizabethville who were willing to talk, who had found the courage to share their pain. Across the entire Congo, the number was certainly higher. Hundreds, possibly thousands of children removed from their mothers in the name of colonial order and Christian charity. Father Dubois heard about what Marie-Thérèse and Vermeer were doing. He reached out through intermediaries. It would not have been appropriate for a Catholic priest to be seen meeting privately with a Congolese woman. Such a transgression would invite immediate suspicion, and eventually they arranged a meeting at Vermeer's house under the cloak of darkness. Dubois brought his private ledger, his meticulous documentation of the children who had disappeared from the mission. Marie-Thérèse brought her notebooks of testimonies filled with the raw, unfiltered voices of grieving mothers. They compared records, cross-referenced names and dates, and realized they were documenting the same system from different angles. Two separate streams of evidence converging into a single horrifying truth. "This is not just happening at my mission," Dubois said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and despair. "This is policy. This is organized. This is happening across the entire colony, and it has been happening for years. It is a deliberate act of the state." "Can you stop it?" Marie-Thérèse asked, her eyes fixed on his, a desperate hope flickering within her. Dubois looked at her with an expression that was equal parts shame and helplessness. "I am one priest. The colonial government does not answer to me. The church hierarchy supports the Mate program. They see it as missionary work, as saving souls, as a noble endeavor. If I speak out too loudly, I will be removed and replaced with someone who will not ask questions, someone who will simply follow orders. Then what good are you?" The words came out harsher than Marita's intended, a raw accusation, but she did not take them back. It was a question that echoed in the silent room, a challenge to his moral authority. Dubois did not have an answer. What good was he? What good was any of them trapped in a system designed to separate mothers from children, to erase identities, to serve a colonial order that valued racial purity over human bonds, bureaucratic efficiency over human suffering? But Vermeer, the practical accountant, had an idea, a cold, calculated strategy. "We document everything, every case we can find, every child removed, every mother who lost a child. We create a record so complete, so detailed that it cannot be ignored or denied, and we send copies to Belgium, to newspapers, to Catholic organizations, to politicians who might care. We make this public. We force them to confront their own policies." It was a dangerous plan. Criticizing colonial policy could result in arrest, deportation, or worse. The colonial administration did not tolerate dissent, especially from Europeans who dared to side with the colonized, but it was also the only plan they had, the only weapon they possessed against the vast, impersonal machinery of the state. So they continued their work quietly, carefully accumulating evidence of a program that was legal, documented, approved by the highest levels of Belgian colonial administration, and profoundly, irredeemably cruel. The notebooks grew thicker, the testimonies more numerous. Each page a testament to a stolen life, a broken heart. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Katanga province intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. In March 1939, as the shadows of war began to lengthen across Europe, Vermeer sent a package to Brussels. It was a thick, heavy parcel containing copies of all the documentation they had gathered. Maritz's meticulously recorded testimonies, Father Dubois' private ledger with its chilling accounts of disappearing children, official transfer records, medical assessments detailing the whitening process, everything. He sent it to a journalist named Paul-Henri Spark, who worked for Louis, a major Belgian newspaper, and who had a reputation for investigating colonial abuses, albeit cautiously. The package included a cover letter carefully worded by Vermeer explaining the Maté program, the scale of child removals, and the systematic erasure of Congolese identities, presenting it as a matter of grave public interest and moral concern. Spark received the package in April. He was a seasoned journalist accustomed to the complexities and sensitivities of colonial affairs, but even he was taken aback by the sheer volume and chilling detail of the documentation. He read through the reports, verified what he could through his own discreet sources within the colonial administration, and began writing an exposé, a damning indictment of a policy cloaked in benevolence. But before he could publish, before the truth could reach the Belgian public, he received a visit from two impeccably dressed men who identified themselves as representatives of the Ministry of Colonies. They were polite but firm, their voices low and measured, their message unmistakable. Publishing the story, they explained, would be unwise. It would damage Belgium's international reputation, already fragile in the face of growing anti-colonial sentiment. It would undermine colonial authority, potentially inciting unrest in the Congo at a time when global stability was paramount. Surely Mauzy Spark, a man of such intelligence and patriotism, understood the delicate nature of colonial governance. Surely he could see that this was not a story that served the public interest, but rather threatened the very fabric of the Belgian Empire. Spark was a good journalist, committed to truth, but he was also a pragmatic one, acutely aware of the power wielded by the state. He did not publish the story. Instead, he filed the documentation away, marking it sensitive material hold for future consideration. The exposé, the culmination of so much pain and so much effort, would remain unpublished for another 78 years, gathering dust in a forgotten archive, a testament to the power of official suppression. In Elizabethville, the consequences were more immediate and devastating. In June 1939, Father Dubois was abruptly transferred to a remote mission in Equator Province over 1,000 kilometers away, deep in the dense rainforest where he would spend the rest of his career ministering to a small village with no Maté children and no access to colonial archives. It was a clear message, a punishment for his inconvenient curiosity. His private ledger, the meticulous record of stolen lives, disappeared during the transfer. Confiscated, he assumed, though no one ever officially acknowledged taking it. Its contents absorbed into the vast silent machinery of the state. Veer was not arrested, but his contract with the mining company was not renewed. He was given 3 months to settle his affairs and return to Belgium, his usefulness to the colonial project having expired. He offered to take Marie Terres with him to help her search for Celeste in Bruges, a desperate last-ditch effort, but they both knew it was impossible. A Congolese woman traveling to Belgium with a white man would raise questions neither of them could answer. Questions that would expose them to suspicion and danger. And even if she made it to Bruges, even if she found the orphanage, what then? Celeste would be 14 years old, raised as a European with no memory of her mother, no knowledge of her Congolese heritage. Would Marie Terres introduce herself? Would she try to reclaim a daughter who had been taught that her African blood was something to be hidden, overcome, erased? The thought was a fresh agony, a realization that even if she found her, Celeste might be lost to her forever. In August 1939, Louis Vermeer left the Congo. He gave Maritz all the documentation they had gathered, the notebooks filled with testimonies, the copies of official records along with enough money to live on for several months. He promised to continue searching for information about Celeste from Belgium to send word if he learned anything. He kept that promise, writing letters to Mars for the next 3 years. His neat, precise handwriting, a small comfort in her desolate world until the war made communication impossible, and his letters stopped coming. Maritz never saw him again. She never learned what happened to him, whether he survived the war, whether he continued his search, whether he ever thought about the Congolese woman who had trusted him with her story. But she kept the documentation, adding to it over the years, finding new mothers, recording new testimonies, maintaining a record of what had been done to them and their children, a quiet act of defiance against a system that sought to erase their pain. The Maté program continued throughout World War II and into the 1950s, largely uninterrupted by the global conflict. The mission to San Josef expanded, housing over 200 children by 1950. Other missions were established across the Congo, all serving the same purpose, all part of the same vast dehumanizing enterprise. The colonial government refined its procedures, making the removal process more efficient, more systematic, more difficult to resist. By the time the Congo gained independence in 1960, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 mixed-race children had been removed from their mothers and either placed in missions or transferred to Belgium, their lives irrevocably altered by the policies of a distant colonial power. The program ended not because of moral awakening or public outcry, but because the Congo became independent and the Belgian colonial administration lost its authority to remove children. The missions were gradually closed or transferred to Congolese control. The children who remained were released, sent back to communities that often did not know what to do with them. Young adults who had been raised as Europeans in an African country that was now trying to define its own identity without colonial interference. Many struggled to adapt, caught between two worlds belonging fully to neither. Many of the children who had been sent to Belgium never learned their true origins. They grew up believing they were orphans or that their parents had died or that they had been abandoned. Some discovered the truth later through documents found after adoptive parents died, through DNA tests, through chance encounters with relatives who recognized family resemblances, a sudden shocking revelation of a hidden past. But many never knew. They lived their entire lives as Europeans, never knowing they had mothers who had searched for them, who had stood outside mission walls, hoping for glimpses, who had kept 200 franc notes as evidence of what had been taken from them. Their hearts forever broken by a truth they could not speak. Marie Tz Kawina died in 1973 in Lubumbashi, the city that had once been called Elizabethville. She was 68 years old, her body worn by a lifetime of labor and grief, her spirit marked by an unyielding sorrow. She never saw Celeste again. She never learned what happened to her daughter after the orphanage in Bruges, whether she was adopted, whether she married, whether she had children of her own. The documentation Maritere had spent decades compiling was found in her room after her death. Notebooks filled with testimonies, copies of colonial records, letters from Vermeer, and a small cloth bag containing 200 francs in bills, so old and worn they were barely legible. A tangible relic of her enduring pain. Her niece, who inherited her belongings, did not know what to do with the notebooks. They were written in French, which the niece could not read fluently, and they documented events that seemed impossibly distant, part of a colonial past that the newly independent Congo was trying desperately to forget to move beyond. So she stored them in a trunk where they remained for another 40 years, silent witnesses to a forgotten tragedy until 2013 when a Congolese historian researching colonial-era child removal programs learned about their existence and arranged to have them digitized and archived, finally bringing Marie Tere's quiet resistance into the light. Those notebooks, along with Father Dubois' ledger, which had not been destroyed but had been filed away in church archives in Belgium, a testament to the church's own complicity and the documentation Vermeer had sent to Paul-Henri Spuck, eventually formed the basis for a 2017 Belgian government report on the Maté program. The report acknowledged that between 1908 and 1960, thousands of mixed-race children had been forcibly removed from their Congolese mothers under colonial policies that prioritized racial classification over family bonds. The report used careful language, regrettable practices, policies that did not meet contemporary human rights standards, actions taken with good intentions but problematic outcomes. It was an official acknowledgement carefully couched of a profound injustice. In 2019, the Belgian government issued a formal apology to the Maté children and their mothers. Prime Minister Charles Michel stood in the Belgian parliament and acknowledged that what had been done was wrong, that the removals constituted a violation of human rights, that the mothers who lost their children deserved recognition, and the children who were taken deserved to know their true origins. It was a historic moment covered by international media, praised by human rights organizations, a long overdue reckoning with a dark chapter of history. But apologies do not return stolen children. They do not restore lost years, repair broken bonds, or undo the trauma of separation. They do not bring back Marita Kawana, who died never knowing what happened to her daughter. They do not help Celeste Dez if she is still alive, if she ever learned her real name, if she ever discovered that her mother did not give her up willingly, but had her torn away by men with papers and policies, and the absolute certainty that they were doing the right thing. The scars of that separation, the wounds of that erasure run deep across generations, across continents. The Mate program was not a secret conspiracy. It was not hidden in shadows or carried out by rogue officials. It was official policy documented in government records, approved by colonial ministers, implemented by priests and territorial agents who believed they were serving a greater good, a civilizing mission. The horror was not that it was done in darkness, but that it was done in daylight with paperwork, with bureaucratic efficiency, with the full support of institutions that claimed to represent civilization, Christianity, and progress. It was a system that dehumanized with a smile, that inflicted pain with a pen, that destroyed families with the cold logic of administrative procedure. And that perhaps is the most disturbing part of this story. Not that it happened, but that it was legal. Not that children were taken, but that their removal was considered proper, appropriate, necessary. Not that mothers grieved, but that their grief was dismissed as ignorance, their love deemed insufficient, their motherhood revocable by men who never had to look them in the eyes while signing the papers that erased their children from their lives. It is a chilling reminder that the greatest horrors are often perpetrated not by monsters, but by ordinary people following orders, believing in their own righteousness, and meticulously documenting every step of their institutional cruelty. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next. 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 See you in the next.